If there are any football scores that you need, I have a treasury of them. If you'll raise your hand, I'll be glad to tell you the score of your appropriate game. About the early part of this week, I was in Eugene, and I like to run down by the river. So those of you who know Eugene know where the Owen Rose Garden is. I drive down there and park, and then jog around the river. There's a jogging bicycle path there. As I came back up, I guess it was Jefferson or Madison, to 8th, and turned right on 8th and went over to Monroe, where there was a bagel shop, and I felt a strange heart tug. So I stopped there, and I went in and told the gal that was selling bagels, who couldn't have cared less, and who wasn't even born when the things happened that I told her about, that this building had a great sentimental meaning to me, because it was a building that was built by my father and my grandfather during the Second World War. I think between VE Day and VJ Day. And there are so many memories tied up with that building in my mind. One of them is having the Cash family come in with the 3 Cash boys, of whom Gene was the oldest. They used to come in and trade with us in that grocery store. We lived in a house right behind, and I grew up there. That's really the only home I knew in Eugene before I left home and went away to school. And I thought of all the things that had happened in my life on that corner before the store was built, and then when Dad was building it during the war, and there was a crisis in getting building materials, and his ulcer got even worse because he wasn't sure if he could finish, and he'd rented out the previous store building, and the time came and he had to let the other folks have that building, and our building wasn't ready, and we had to do the store out of the back room of the new building, and people had to walk through mud holes on boards to get there, and we had orange crate shelves that we used, and we tried to do business there with wires strung across the ceiling and naked light bulbs hanging down. And now it's a bagel place, and right next door is a musical instrument place, but it meant a lot to me to go back after 4.5 decades and to see something which had been so much a part of my life. That vision came back to me since I've gotten here, and I was walking down that walkway between the administration building and the gym. It's a lovely little spot in there, little fountain. And it occurred to me, what will it be like to come back here in 5 years? Will I even be able to walk this way? Will someone have built a fence around this property? Any of these wonderful students that have been so courteous this week and gone out of their way to be nice to us, will there be any of them around, or what will it be? And how sad I thought it will be if it's not what it is now and it's something else. And I wondered to myself, if that were to happen 5 years from now, if I would say to myself, you know, I gave X number of dollars. I could have given 5 times that much. I could have given 5 times that much. And by now, 5 years later, I wouldn't even have known the difference. And I wonder if I had. I'm still talking about 5 years down the way in my imaging. If I had, I wonder if there would be students here and all the wonderful things would be happening that have been happening now for about 40 years, I guess. I pray the school survives. I pray that a lot of us who don't have a lot, who really could make a sacrifice, will do that. There are a lot of people in the books. Make a pledge of $1,000. I hope we will. That text that Jim read talks about the promise to Abram, which, if you were in the class that I taught today, really dovetails into the end of that class. It is God's promise of grace after the failure at the Tower of Babel. And it ends by saying that in you, as God spoke to Abram, all the nations of the earth will, depending on the translation, bless themselves or be blessed. I think in terms of movies. Every day at noon I eat my bag of popcorn and my sandwich, and I have a VCR and a TV in my office, and I watch half a movie at my lunch hour. So I think in terms of movies, and I think in terms of a screen. And superimposed on the top of that screen would be the words, "And in you shall all the families or nations of the earth be blessed." It's about humanity and not just families, although it would include families. And then think about all the scenes that would pass and that are scenes that involve God's working through history to bring that to pass. And you can just let your mind range through the patriarchal period and the Egyptian slavery and the wandering and the entry and the conquest and the kings and the prophets and the captivity and the return. And as you let your mind wander through those scenes and just see them there as pictures under that general heading, "And in you shall all the nations of the earth be blessed," you will recognize, as it's been pointed out to us so well this week, that many of those scenes are scenes which seem to be in direct contradiction to the words at the top of the screen. How can this possibly be, given what's happening here? That's the biblical story, isn't it? It's a story of things that would make it appear. It's even the story in the New Testament. Read the book of Acts. And somewhere there, then, you would see the bloody depiction of violence, which was the crucifixion. And maybe those scenes leading up to it. I don't like to see films that have violence in them. I would not like to have seen a crucifixion. Seeing violence in the screen, and that is to avert my eyes. I don't like to see someone's body punctured or sawed or torn or violently mishandled. I don't like to see blood flow. There's something about blood coming out of a human body that just unnerves me. I don't like to see people brutalized and insulted and tortured and degraded, deliberately degraded in the most loathsome ways known to the culture. And yet all of those things would be what I would be forced to look at if I were to see that ultimate episode under "In you shall all the families of the earth be blessed," the crucifixion of Jesus. Because the message is about what difference it makes in families because he was crucified and raised again. It's about love. And that strikes me as a strange thing, because love has been around ever since man has been around, and before, God is love, and so there's always been love. But something new has come in that bloody crucifixion scene that was not there before. My wife and I made commitments a while back, since both of our mothers are getting old. Mine's 84, hers is 81, and they're in failing health. And her mother's in Florida, and my mother's here, and we're in Texas, and we're a long ways away. And the commitment said that whatever our mothers need, even to the point of in terms of time or energy or the giving of ourselves or money, we'll do that, because these are our mothers. I wouldn't do that for you, because you don't sustain the same relationship to me, but I would do it for my mother. I would do it for my wife. If there came extra demands upon me, demands that normally we say are unreasonable and to which we cannot respond, we go past that and we fulfill those demands for the sake of a spouse. I have two very, very close friends, perhaps the closest I've ever had. And they for me and I for them would practice this kind of extreme exertion and gift because of the special relationship that we have. Against this background, we see the horror of the crucifixion, and we ask of this repulsive and shocking deed. Why? It's not difficult to explain why he is there and why he is there, but why is he there? And the answer that's given, echoing through the universe from God himself, is one that we all know as a part of orthodoxy. He is there, the voice says, for you. He says that to me, and my answer is incredulity. Now, how could he be there for me? He doesn't even know me. Or how could he be there for me? Because I know that I have never done anything to deserve this kind of a sacrifice on my behalf. And so if someone says he's there for you, my inclination is to disbelief. Now, I accept it because it's a part of orthodoxy, and I believe the Orthodox Christian formulation, but I will be honest with you, I have never been able to get that into my gut. Down inside, at the feeling level, that he died for me. I say it, I believe it, but I've never been able to really internalize it. Because my concept of love just does not go that far. A love given to me by someone who's never acquainted with me personally, my word isn't that big. A love given to me in the sacrifice of a life when there is nothing about me deserving my love, my definition of love does not go that far. And yet, when we say that what Jesus has brought into life and to families is love, that's the kind of love we're talking about. It's as if the word love is cruising through space and suddenly it goes into warp speed and it's gone. And we're lingering back here trying to understand it in terms of what happened before it took off. It says that even for the most spiritual person here, with the deepest and most profound spiritual insight, even that person's concept of love is childish play. We're dabbling on the fringes of a concept, even in those moments which are so rich that you can never explain them because they're at a feeling level, even in those moments when you say that love is so magnificent that it just transports your whole being. Even in those moments, we're just playing. If the reality is what is indicated to us by the crucifixion, that our definitions, whatever they are, our neat little words, our feelings, whatever they are down here, and the reality goes off into infinity. And yet, that reality which has gone off at warp speed now comes back and is given to us, and we are told, as those who are new people in Christ, as those who understand the fulfillment of the promise that in Him all families, nations of the earth will be blessed, we are told that the main call of our lives is the call to love. How can this be? How can we be called upon to do something that we can't even begin to comprehend? You see the magnitude of the challenge that's placed before us. Of course, God understands where we are and what's involved, so that He knows we are called to a challenge here that we can never meet. God forbid that we should ever think we've arrived here. And that we are called to a challenge in which there is the possibility of infinite growth. You will never reach the top of this ladder. You may never get off the first rung and yet be a giant among Christian people in the call to the practice of love. And so I want to talk today about two things. One is the practice of love, because I think that's the thing that Christ brings to families, to human beings, to relationships. And then secondly, I want to talk about power. There is a paradox here in that though we are called to be loving people, we are also warned about inordinate loves, and we are told in the context of family, which may sound a strange way to end this series this week, that we dare not love family ultimately, but we must love family secondarily, and that we must love God more than we love family. Jesus' mother and brothers came to see him in Luke chapter 8 and verse 19. Your mother and your brothers are outside to see you. Jesus said, my mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God and do it. Something that draws you more closely to Jesus than the woman who bore him and gave birth to him and his brothers? Yes. As he calls to himself disciples in the end of Luke chapter 9, they have on their mind various familial responsibilities, the burial of a father, or saying goodbye to those who are at home, and Jesus answers in language that sounds harsh, tell the dead to bury their own dead. Come and preach the gospel. And to the man who wants to go home and say goodbye to his family, Jesus uses the little saying about the farm. No one puts his hand to the plow and then looks back. Something is more important than mom and dad, brother and sister, children. And then that great discipleship text in Luke chapter 14, beginning in verse 25, he talks about the fact that if anyone would be my disciple, and he uses the word hate, he doesn't mean hate in the sense he condemns elsewhere. He probably means something like love less, or hate anything in them that contradicts your discipleship to me. Hate father and mother and brother and sister and wife and children, even your own life. Take the passage and take out father and mother and brother and sister and wife and children and put in the names of the people in your circle who are in those places. And then you begin to see something of the power of the passage, where it says that as important as they are, as significant as relationships are, as much as relationships mean to us, and life is largely relationships, none of that can transcend relationship to God. If that choice comes, it's got to be God. And the paradox is that we can only love our families the most until when we love God the most. When we love family more than we love God, we will not love family as much as we ought to. When we love God more than we love family, and we hear the call of God to genuine love, then we'll love our families even more. The second thing I want to say has to do with the nature of love. We've already made reference, I think Bill Such made reference to the passage in Ephesians chapter 5 that talks about the relationship of husband and wife. Tyrannical husbands love to camp on that text to get their wives to be in subjection. Cowering wives read that text and misunderstand it. But we should all understand, I think we do, that before Paul even talks about husbands being the head of the wives and wives showing respect and reverence for their husbands, that Paul says that you ought to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. You have noticed that verse, verse 21. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Before he ever says, wives, be subject to your husbands, he's already said that, and husbands, be subject to your wives. And I scratched my head over that one. Is it a contradiction? What does Paul mean? But then as you begin to think about it, the text is about love. Husbands, love your wives. The word is agape or agapao or whatever form is used there. Same word that's used to describe God's love for us. And if you are in a relationship where the commitment of the two people is a commitment of love, what does a loving commitment do? If I love you, what do? I become your servant. That's the essence of love. If you love me, you become my servant. I cannot love you and be domineering. I give myself to you as a person who loves you. I'm seeking your good. I'm seeking for you above all else the blessings of God. I'm your servant. I'm your foot washer, whatever is involved here. And so I give myself to you. And so it seems to me in that way, husbands are subject to wives. They love their wives, and therefore they give themselves in service to their wives. And no husband who ever understands that can be the domineering type that we see pictured sometimes in those parodies of Christianity. Her husband is going to be put in a servile position, but you're going to have a relationship in which you aren't asking questions about dominance and authority and all of that kind of business because you're operating on a different level. The great text, of course, is 1 Corinthians 13. It is to be applied to every relationship of life. Taken in isolation, it's a marvelous text. And that's very often how it's taken, but if seen in context, it's even more significant, because it is Paul addressing that fractured church in Corinth, where you've got pride and you've got parties and you've got sexual immorality and you have people insisting on rights. Does that sound modern? And people going to law with each other, and you might go to church on Sunday morning and find some people kind of weaving around and giggling because they've come to a state of hilarity in the time when the supper should be taken. Church service on Sunday morning is a babble by God with various spiritual gifts, have not learned the appropriate discipline for using those gifts. How do you solve all this stuff? Go away. I will show you a more excellent way. He ends chapter 12, and then in chapter 13 there is that great hymn to love, where it is said that Paul takes the ray of love and shoots it through a prism and breaks it up into its component parts. I suppose other things could be said about love besides what Paul says here in this chapter, but these are things that were of particular appropriateness to the church that was there. And they are also appropriate to be applied to the family, not the larger family of God, but the family related by blood. And so he says love is the solution. And you need to understand what love is like. He says love is patient. And he uses a word there which, if chased through the rest of the New Testament, is generally used with regard to God and his patience with humanity, which when I think about it just goes beyond my understanding, because I cannot understand why God is patient with me as many times as I've messed up. Sometimes I'm just overwhelmed by the sense of God's patience with me. I don't know how you feel about yourself. It is a word that indicates patience with people, and you wait and you wait and you wait. And if your kid doesn't hit a home run, or your kid does make an error, or whatever it is, you don't shout at them from the stand. You realize that your children did not come forth from the womb perfect. And they don't get perfect by the time they're 12 or the time they're 24. And you did not marry a perfect man or did not marry a perfect woman. Well, my wife married a perfect man, but that's the only exception I know. And so you're patient. Love is patient. Why are you patient? Because you love. Why do you love? Because there's a cross standing in the history of the world, and it stands there for you, and that's what makes you different. And love is kind. If we reduce all love to kindness. Yes, love is kind, and that's another word which, if you chase it down, is used mostly in the New Testament to refer to God. And that's, again, a puzzle when you consider what human beings are like and wonder how God could be kind. And Paul says, applying this to the Corinthian situation and to ours, that love is not jealous. Siblings not jealous of each other. Husband and wife not jealous of each other. Not grabbing, trying to have what the other has because of jealousy, but rejoicing in what happens with the other person because you're not thinking competitively. That's where jealousy comes from, the competitive sense. But you're thinking lovingly in terms of all people. And family, as we love in the family, not boastful. Love is not arrogant. And we do see that in the family. How many families have you seen where the father insists that he be served as if he is a slave master? It works in other subtle ways as well. Arrogance. The assumption, hardly ever spoken because it's too blatant, but the assumption where either husband or wife believes secretly and communicates in subtle ways, I'm the better one of the two of us. And how many little undercurrents are poisoning marriages or families because there is this sense of arrogance. Love is not rude. The word rude is an interesting word. It's sometimes translated nakedness. And it's a word which seems to refer to doing those things which embarrass, humiliate other people, shock other people. Love does not do that. Love is not interested in embarrassing people. And so love is not going to be rude because of someone's background, because of what they bring into the situation. Love is not going to be rude if someone has gone through a humiliating circumstance by capitalizing on that and ridiculing them because of what they've happened. Does that make you think of brothers and sisters? Love is going to be extremely sensitive in all of these delicate situations that come up, and these differences that people bring as their own baggage into the marriage relationship. Love does not seek its own way. I think here, if there is a part of the text that's the very center of it, the hub of which around which all the rest goes, it's right here. Love does not seek its own way. I think you could argue that everything else that's said is really a teasing out of some dimension of love does not seek its own way. I have a good friend who's a lawyer in Cleveland, Ohio. And I see him every year at the Lake Geneva encampment at Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, which, by the way, is a great time and you ought to go. I'll give details afterwards if you want them. And Kip tells me about Christian people who decide to divorce, and so they come to him because they know he is a Christian. He doesn't like to have to do this, but sometimes it's necessitated by the circumstances. And he said to me, as I've watched these people come, I've been able to figure out what it is that in almost every case leads to a divorce. It is selfishness that leads to divorce. It wears many other hats, it's called by many other names, but it's selfishness. I'm going to get my way, I'm going to get my way, and sometimes it's over something so trivial that the rest of us laugh, but it wasn't funny for them. And because you've got two people who do not understand the basic call of love is to give, but rather who are concerned to grab and to get, the marriage breaks up with all of the concomitant tragedies that are a part of the end of a marriage. Love, Paul says, is not irritable. He's using probably there the explosive word. Sometimes we can't help that, but I think the more we love, the less likely those things are. And I would say that's the one we need to be warned about between 5 and 6:30 in the evening. Keep your big mouth shut. Do you understand what I'm saying? Keep your big mouth shut when you're around your mate from 5 to 6:30 in the evening, and don't say anything till you get some food in your stomach. Have any of you had the experience I've had of having a profound change of psychology right in the middle of the evening meal, and you can just feel it come over you? Have any of you had that feeling? It happens to me all the time. We usually eat in the cafeteria, my wife and I, because she works and I work too. And we get there, and right in the middle of the broccoli, not asparagus. I want to tell you about asparagus. When the Lord cursed the earth, the first plant that grew up was asparagus. You need to know that. It was satanic. God did not invent asparagus. And right in the middle, you can just feel this peace come over you. Keep your mouth shut from 5 to 6:30. Love is not irritable. That's where I began. I knew I'd get back there if I tried. Love is not resentful. I believe there are a lot of homes in which there are low-grade resentments. And you wonder why you're so grumpy, and why you're so unresponsive, and why you're so sulky, and why you won't communicate. And if you're honest and look into your own heart, you may discover that you're resentful because of the way the toothpaste tube is squeezed. Or because you asked me that 5 minutes ago and I told you, and if you aren't going to remember what I tell you when you ask me, why should I tell you again? Or the suggestion that you're hard of hearing. You know what word we're hearing around our house most these days? Same one as at your house. Huh? Huh? We're hearing that all the time. Huh? My wife, I'm sure, can't hear as well as she used to. And she also doesn't talk as loud as she used to talk either. Love does not rejoice at wrong. Love rejoices at the right. It bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. And because we have received love from Christ, and because we understand love better than anyone else, and because we have committed ourselves not to be self-centered, but to be servants, and because we know that love is at the center of everything and love makes the world go round, there is a difference in Christian homes because we have made a commitment to love and to a special kind of love which is spelled out by cross. And that means we forgive as the cross forgave, made our forgiveness possible. And it means that we are concerned to fulfill the needs of our mate. And it means that if we need to communicate, we will communicate. And it means that we need to be concerned about the ego needs of those other people in the family. And we're trying to respond to those needs and not just demand that they respond to ours. And we are, when we have sensed points of irritation and hurting, we are people committed to avoiding those places. You know how to hurt your mate in 1 second. You don't have to fool around, you know. And you can deliver the knockout punch, and people who love, I think, get as far away from those things as they possibly can and never employ them in the kind of dialogue that takes place in the family. And we provide the need for intimacy, and we provide the family situation where we can afford to be open and vulnerable, and where we never have to be like this because someone has taken advantage of our confession of weakness. Where for one place in life we can let people know what we are, and they'll be sympathetic and not condemnatory, and we will try to make ourselves more lovable, and we will try to remain more interesting persons. I also want to say, with regard to the kind of love that Christ brings to a marriage, is that Jesus brings a sense of commitment. Matthew 5:30, and then he talks about divorce. Whoever divorces his wife shall give her a certificate of divorce, but I say to you, basically no divorce. In Matthew, except for unchastity, no exception clause in Mark and in Luke. And we have been engaged for years in theological pretzel bending, trying to do with that passage what it was never intended to do. It is not a passage about the back end of divorce, it's a passage about the front end. It is not spoken to people who are divorced, it is spoken to people who are married. It is not trying to give a series of legalistic rules about who can and who can't do what when they've been married to whomever, how many times, and they were divorced, and for what reason, and who's sleeping with whom, and how many times, and all that stuff. That's not what those passages are about. Now, I think there are texts that deal with those things, but they aren't the ones that we normally go to. The texts that deal with mercy and repentance and commitment and covenant breaking and all that kind of thing. But what Jesus is saying, if I understand him, is stay with the relationship. Quit putting your wives away for any stupid reason. One rabbi said you can divorce her if she puts too much salt in your food. Now, I grant you he was a liberal rabbi. Another one who was liberal but not quite that liberal said you can divorce her if she's a brawling woman. And the question was asked, how do you know if she's brawling? And the answer was given, if you can hear her in the next house, she's brawling. So fuss at your husband and keep your voice down, babe, you know, and you won't be divorced. He can't divorce you then. And Jesus is talking about commitment, and I tell you, we need to emphasize in our own lives, but also in the lives of those who are 1 and 2 and 3 and unborn and teenagers, that when you get married, you are not doing something in a rush of emotion, you are making a promise. The ceremony says, till death do us part. Scott Mitchells, as you know, have a daughter, Debbie, who was critically injured in an automobile accident, and her husband, Gary, was given up for dead. They got Debbie out of the wreck. They thought there was no hope for Gary. But he was alive, and though he is, if you were to see him, far from having the full capacities that he once had, he has made remarkable improvement. And one day last year, Gary spoke to the chapel at Abilene Christian. I was not there. I was out of town. I've listened to the tape of it. The Mitchells have a videotape. I'm sure they would be glad for you to watch it, probably about 20 minutes long. And Gary, in his weak voice, addressed that crowd of 3,000 to 3,500 students and talked about what he'd been through. And the point that he made that was so powerful was that this woman, Debbie, who was on the stage, promised when she married me that she would be with me in sickness and in health, whatever happened. And though my body has been ravaged, this woman has stayed with me. She's been at my bedside, and she was even when she didn't need to be there because of her own condition, and has stuck with him. And you can't listen to that tape without tears coming to your eyes. especially if you know Gary and Debbie. In fact, Scott can't even talk about it. I don't know if Scott's here or not, but he can't talk about it without tears coming to his eyes. And she stuck by his side because that's what marriage is. She didn't know when she and Gary got married. They snuck off and got married, the rascals. She didn't know what was going to happen. As far as she knew, he was going to have full use of his faculties for 50, 60 years. She didn't know. And when that speech was over, that whole crowd stood and applauded. And it went on and on and on. Those kids will never forget what they heard that day about the promise you make when you marry someone. You can't make promises about your feelings. You just can't do it because feelings come and go. In fact, you can pretty well promise that you're not going to always feel the same way about your mate you felt during courtship. You can just almost guarantee that. But you can make promises about a commitment. I've come to know you, I've fallen in love with you, it's a wonderful thing romantically, but we've talked about other things as well, about our lives, about our interests, about our relationships, about our faith. And it's that kind of love, that's steadfast love, like God's love. It leads me to say to you, when we stand in front of the officiant, whatever the feelings are, whatever the economic circumstances are, whatever storms come our way, whatever automobile accidents, whatever illnesses, I will be here by your side as long as I'm alive or you are alive. The other half of the talk has to do with power. Oh, it's all very well to say these things. I know I've heard these things before about love and about what it means to be in the family, but we've tried and we can't do it. But that's where Christ also gives something to our relationships, because he gives us power. Moral systems that are non-Christian have a serious lack in that they do not offer power. Christianity does. The power of prayer, the power of the Holy Spirit. I want to say three things about praying for your relationships, for your families. First of all, God does not promise an immediate utopia. You might get that impression from some of the televangelists, but I think some of their theology is poor. He does not promise an immediate utopia. And that's hard to accept in these days of the quick fix where you want to lose 10 pounds in 1 week. But that doesn't mean he doesn't promise to answer. The second thing is that any changes that take place in a marriage or in a family are changes that must come from inside. The externals may or may not change, but the real change is inside. The debts may or may not be paid. The tensions may or may not be removed, but the prayers are that God will change us on the inside so that no matter what happens, even if nothing changes on the outside, we will be changed on the inside. And we will become less selfish and more considerate, and all of these things that are important. And the third thing I would illustrate by the story of a man who came to me years ago when I was holding a meeting in Prescott, Arizona. He was a Jewish gentleman. He'd been to see Billy Graham. He traveled all across the country. He came into the building and promised me a large sum of money if I could guarantee that his wife, who is terminally ill, would get well. Loved the woman so much that he'd gone everywhere trying to get an answer, and I don't know if I gave it or not, was that you've got to want something more than you want her. You've got to want God more than you want your life. I hear people say, I want to go to heaven so I can see John or Mary. We want to go to heaven so we can see God, because if you go to heaven to see John or Mary and that's all you see, you'll be disappointed. But when you go for God's sake, to see Him, then the meeting, if there is one, with John or Mary will be even more glorious, because it will be mediated through God. And He will be the center, as He must be. And so in praying for our relationships, we must pray, first of all, that our relationship to God will be what God wants it to be, and then out of that relationship to Him, which is always primary, these things will come that will resolve the problems that we have in our other relationships. Dick has announced a song, How Firm a Foundation, I believe, was the song, which we're going to sing in just a moment. We could sing this as referring to Christ and what He has brought to family relationships. foundation of His love for us and our call to be loving, and His promise of power to bless us, and the call to faith to believe that He can indeed offer resolution where it seems humanly no resolution is possible. Shall we stand and sing?
How